Incidentally, if some of you have read, about 2 months ago, I think New York Times was kind enough to publish that short text, crazy, of me about this Chinese regulating, I love that topic, this turned me into pro-Chinese, regulating reincarnation, you know, how you have to, and a friend from China said, it's wonderful, I mean, how can, literally, you have a form printed if you want to reincarnate Lama, and it says, I here want like that. I can imagine, with my dirty mind obscenities, how, you know, then a top bureaucrat answers you, sorry, you want to reincarnate as a I don't know, as a Buddhist Lama, sorry, these places are, if you want to incarnate, it's under debate, only some insects and dogs are free for reincarnation, sorry, it doesn't go, and then, but you know that the game goes on. Now something unbelievable happened. Did you read? Dalai Lama announced that he will not reincarnate, but that he wanted his successor to be elected by some kind of a more democratic procedure, like Buddhist figures to elect the successor. And now comes the irony. You know what was the Chinese official answer? You see, secularists betraying Tibetan traditions. No, now Chinese communists stand as defending the true traditions of incarnation against this secularized politician Dalai Lama and so on. But the basic lesson holds, I think. That's the difficult lesson to get from what we learn of today's China, is that, and people are aware of it, in Europe, this debate is beginning. Till now, we secretly hoped that, even if we were cynical about capitalism, but nonetheless, even many left liberals believed that nonetheless, sooner or later, after some periods of authoritarian rule, capitalism brings democracy. It can be for a decade or two, you need a little bit of authoritarian rule to create conditions, but then it takes off. Like, they like to point out how all the big success stories of capitalist explosion, from Chile to South Korea, were opened up through a limited authoritarian rule, which created the conditions. And it's typical, although some, even people close to Bush, already are honest enough to include into this series China. So it's absolutely hypocritical, I claim. Here I even agree with Chinese communists, although they are corrupt and so on, where they claim only, that's the ultimate paradox, only the authoritarian rule of the Communist Party can guarantee ideal conditions of capitalism. It's not that, as some Western liberals think, oh, if capitalism can thrive so nicely today in China, in spite of the party rule, how much more it would be triumphant with liberal democracy. Not more or less. I think it would explode with unrests, probably the unity of China falling apart, and so on and so on. But not to get lost, I think that the sad lesson is that, the sad lesson of this is that we are, I think, approaching a new era, in a way, even here in the United States, where it becomes more and more clear that capitalism and democracy do not go together naturally, how to put it. And I think we should reread history in this way. We tend to forget that this idea of natural coexistence of capitalism and democracy is not natural at all. If you look at the history of 19th century, you have first liberal capitalism, but definitely without democracy. Rather, as I read in some interesting new text in New Left Review, I forgot even the author tries to prove how what happens today in China is much closer to 18th century Europe, where wild capitalism was sustained by a very strong authoritarian rule. Now, so let's not forget that throughout 19th century, things which today liberal boasts, but they are our inheritance. No, they were not at all perceived as part of liberal tradition. What we today understand as universal vote, universal education, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and so on. Sorry, but this was the result of the long years of socialist progressive struggle. That this was not originally part of liberal dogma. We tend to forget this, and I think we should remember this today because, again, I claim we are slowly returning, and that's the lesson of Naomi Klein's book, a sad one, that we are returning to a state where capitalism and democracy no longer, how should I put it, go naturally together. So again, but my point is more fundamental one. Capitalism only works in precise social conditions. It implies the trust into the objective mechanism of market's invisible hand, which, in the guise of what Hegel called cunning of reason, guarantees that the competition of individual egotisms works for the common good. However, I claim, we are today in the midst of a radical change. We are in a situation where, unique in the history of humanity, where a subjective act, collective or even individual, like some crazy collective project like this big dam on the Yellow River that the Chinese are building, on some super terrorist attack, whatever, we don't know what, can catastrophically disturb our lives and cause global catastrophe. So you see my point. My point is that market works where you have time for tests and trials. We have a problem. I try, you try, I fail, you fail. Finally, we find the solution. You need a breathing space, as it were. I claim that when you have this extreme situation we are approaching today, where you have to make now a decision, and you cannot then repeat it and compete and so on and so on. You can no longer count on market mechanisms. You cannot say, okay, global warming is a problem, let's leave this, that approach, market, and so on and so on. At the end, we will find the most efficient mechanism, maybe, but we may be all dead before we find it. The symbol of this is a nice detail which I read in a report on Cuban Missile Crisis. We learned that we were much closer to nuclear war than we thought. What happened on October 27, 1962 is interesting. There was a small skirmish between an American destroyer and a Soviet B-59 submarine off Cuba. The destroyer dropped depth charges near the submarine to try to force it to surface, not knowing that the submarine had a nuclear-tipped torpedo. So Vadim Orlov, a member of the submarine crew, told later that the submarine was authorized in such conditions, when directly attacked, to fire this nuclear torpedo if 3 officers agreed. And then the 3 commanding officers began a fierce shouting debate. 2 of them said yes. 1, we even know his name, family name, Arkhipov, said no. And you can almost say, as some historians said at this conference in Havana later about the Cuban crisis, a guy named Arkhipov saved the world. I mean, can you imagine what would have happened if this guy were to say yes? Russians would start with atomic attack and so on and so on. So, you see my point. In such conditions, you cannot, I claim, play the market game. The second problem I see is the obvious inappropriateness of private property for the so-called intellectual labor. The key antagonism of the so-called new digital industries is how to maintain the form of private property within which only the logic of profit can be maintained. And I think legal complications in biogenetics point in the same directions. Phenomena are emerging which bring the notion of property to weird paradoxes. So again, I'm claiming that in the long term, this will cause crazy oscillations. It doesn't work. I recently spoke, I forgot his name, at some conference in Germany with a conservative economist, German, who says a guy like Bill Gates is an anomaly in the sense that when you have a guy who in 30 years becomes the richest guy in the world, it means that market no longer, even in a strongly distorted way, reflects some kind of social productivity. And so he said it's as if the normal market oscillation is the normal heartbeat, and it's as if today market it's like a heavy heart attack, how should I put it? Market is reacting too irrationally with intellectual property. If you let market to itself, we would be in a situation where, like, imagine just United States government not intervening against Microsoft. You would literally have an individual or a couple of individuals privately owning our entire communicational infrastructure. And in this way, market would even self-cancel itself. So again, I'm not saying this opens up any bright revolutionary prospect or what. I'm simply saying that this is a limit of market mechanisms, that there is something, as it were, in so-called intellectual property, which makes it, if I may use this term, communist in its very principle. The form of private property resists to it. Then, third feature, the socio-ethical implications of new techno-scientific developments, biogenetics, and so on and so on. I think that something also is changing here. The moment you introduce the notion of private property in biogenetics, something extremely problematic is happening, which can lead to imprevisible consequences. And finally, what I repeat all the time in my texts, slums and other new forms of apartheid. New walls are arising. We are moving slowly towards a new apartheid society. And signs are everywhere, even in Europe, which praises itself as more civilized welfare state against vulgar United States and so on. But I totally agree with Immanuel Wallerstein when he predicts as one of the options a kind of a low-level civil war in Europe between the new immigrants and the old European aborigines. We have in France, in United Kingdom, signs of it, so-called religious minorities organizing themselves, and so on and so on. So, not to lose time, I think that this is the crucial geopolitical fact for me. How we usually characterize today's society, this is very fashionable to say, as the society of total digitalized controls and so on, control. We are all controlled. We know the story, how every time you take a walk on New York, at least 20 cameras tape your movement, so that basically if those in power want, they can practically reconstruct the movement of already more or less of every one of us. But I think that there is the opposite movement also occurring. How the state, the more it is total in this sense of controlling population, the more it is simply withdrawing itself from parts of its own territory. As white spots in the map of a state are emerging, slums, places of the excluded, where the state simply withdraws. And I think the big question maybe of our 21st century is what will happen with this growing number of the excluded. Here I see, in spite of his clownish gestures and so on, the big significance of Hugo Chavez. Because whatever you think about him, and I'm far from simply supporting him, but let's be frank, he was the first, and till now, okay, in Bolivia the situation is more complex. We are not dealing with slums there, but with aborigines more. Wasn't he the only one, basically, who fully integrated those excluded in favelas into a political process? The way it was done in all other cases, in Brazil and so on, is either religion or charity, humanitarian, like, oh, every liberal likes to worry. You know, this is for me the liberal formula today. Are we aware how we live here, rich, totally secured, but you know all this, there are people there who need just $5 to make the operation that would save their lives and so on. Liberals like this. What they like to do is, this is the old formula, wonderful, that Orson Welles used in Citizen Kane. Every liberal likes to take care of, you know, this Angelina Jolie stuff and so on, to take care of the poor, because what they are afraid of is not that the poor will die, but that the poor will start taking care of themselves, of course. No, that's the true horror, no? Again, I think that we are literally heading towards a possible civil war with unpredictable consequences here. So, how do these four antagonisms relate to each other? there is a big difference, a gap, which separates the last antagonism, new favelas, slum, excluded, included, from the three other antagonisms.